Imagine you're a Christian. It's the year 150, just about 120 years after Christ rose from the dead. You do not know that there is a New Testament. There are books circulating around, letters from St. Paul, gospels, fake gospels, but there is no official New Testament. Today we're going to look at the history and the formation of the New Testament and how it came to be that there is a biblical New Testament under the authority, as we'll see, of a pope. So let's get started. Our first reference to an Old Testament and a New Testament comes from Tertullian around the year 210, and he says this, quote, "The divine word who is doubly edged with two testaments of the law and the gospel." Here we see Tertullian referring to a Bible, not yet a canon, but a scripture that has an Old and a New section, an Old Covenant, a New Covenant, an Old Testament and a New Testament, and he refers to the Old as the law and the New as the gospel. So how is it that two testaments emerged within the early Christian tradition? Well, around the year 150, St. Justin Martyr recounts that the, quote, memoirs of the apostles are read during Sunday liturgies. This shows us that Christians are not just reading the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, they are now incorporating apostolic writings. Just about 10 years later, around AD 160, the heretic Marcion, we did a whole New Testament lesson on Marcion, he issues the first canon ever. Now, he's a heretic, so his canon is going to be heretical. He issues the Gospel of Luke, which he has modified and changed, and also 10 of Paul's epistles. And he says these books and these books alone belong to the New Testament. And this sparks a response from the Bishop of Rome and from the Catholic bishops. So we see around the year 170 a document known as the Muratorian Fragment. In this document, it refers to the Bishop of Rome, who is Pope St. Pius I, and it gives a list of biblical books that are very similar to our own canon, but it omits a few books. For example, it omits Hebrews, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, James, and it mentions two epistles of John. We have three epistles, and we're not sure which one the Muratorian Fragment is missing, probably the third epistle of John. And it refers to the books as being received or held in the Catholic Church, in common throughout the world, in Catholica. So in the year 170, we see already a response to the heretical canon of the heretic Marcion. About 10 years later, circa AD 180, St. Irenaeus explains that all Christians everywhere receive four Gospels. So here we see the canonization of the four Gospels, not just the one of Luke, but of all four. Now, things develop over time. We see generally Catholic Christians receiving the same books, sometimes missing some like Hebrews or 2 Peter, sometimes adding some like 1 Clement. But around the year 330, so this is after the time of during the time of Constantine, after the First Nicene Council, Eusebius of Caesarea provides a rough draft of the New Testament. He says this, quote, "First then must be put the Holy Quaternion of the Gospels, following them the Acts of the Apostles, the Epistles of Paul, the Epistles of John, the Epistle of Peter. After them is to be placed, if it really seems proper, the Apocalypse of John, concerning which we shall give the different opinions at proper time. These then belong among the accepted writings," end quote. And so we see here that he doesn't include James or the other two epistles of John. So this is the year 330. In 363, the Council of Laodicea lists 26 books. It omits the book of Revelation. There's a lot of controversy over the book of Revelation because it has some fantastical imagery. In 367, we finally find the issuing of a 27-book list that matches the Catholic list of the 27 books of the New Testament. And it comes from that great defender of the Holy Trinity, that great opponent of the heretic Arius, St. Athanasius of Alexandria. He writes a letter in 367. It's an Easter epistle, a Paschal epistle, and he lists the 27 books that we now have, and he calls them, in Greek, canonized. So here's our first reference to a canon of Scripture, and it matches perfectly our 27 books. Now, this gets ratified shortly thereafter in 382. Pope Damasus calls a council in Rome, and he copies that exact same list that Athanasius gave us, and he proclaims it as the official New Testament. And the reading goes just like this, quote, 4 books of the Gospels, 1 book of Acts of the Apostles, 13 letters of the Apostle Paul, 1 of him to the Hebrews, 2 of Peter, 3 of John, 1 of James, 1 of Jude, and the Apocalypse of John, end quote. So there it is. That is the official ratification of the New Testament under a pope in Rome. The year is 382. All of us should memorize that year, 382. It's important to memorize this number because the Trinity was formally, dogmatically defined in 325. So the Catholic Church first defines the Trinity, and then it's some 60 years later that we actually get the full New Testament. Shortly thereafter, in 393 to 419, under the influence of St. Augustine of Hippo in the North African councils in Hippo and in Carthage, we see a further ratification of these books that were decreed in Rome. And it's also interesting to note that from about 350 to 466 and even beyond, out in the east, in Syria and Antioch, they seem to have only accepted a 22-book canon, and they omit 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, and Revelation. The Nestorian Church of the East that went all the way to China in the Middle Ages still held to that 22-book canon. So how did the early church, the Pope, the Fathers determine what was in the Bible and what was outside the Bible? Well, let's look at the 4 criteria that they used. The first criterion was antiquity. Did this book, gospel, or epistle originate in the 1st century in the time of the apostles? Yes or no? Secondly, apostolicity. Did each one of these books, epistles, or gospels, were they written by an apostle or one closely associated with an apostle? So was it written by Paul, Peter, or someone attached to them, like Mark is attached to Peter, Luke is attached to Paul? The third is Catholicity. Did each one of these books or epistles, were they received throughout the whole Catholic Church? Were they read and received in Rome, in Jerusalem, Alexandria, and so on and so forth? And then fourth, orthodoxy. Were each one of these books orthodox? Did they contradict the preaching and the oral tradition of the Catholic bishops in each city? If there were books that were claiming to be written by apostles, but they taught heresy, immediately they were rejected. For example, there's a Gospel of Thomas, which alleges to be written by the Apostle Thomas, but it contains outright heresy, Gnosticism. So the bishops never received this book. They saw it as a fake, as a fraud, and so it was rejected and never included in the canon. So those are the 4 criteria that the early church used. What can we learn from this? Well, from an apologetics point of view, we speak to Christians that are Protestants, Lutherans, evangelicals, and they claim Scripture alone. And yet, for the first 300 years of Christianity, there was no defined New Testament. You couldn't have a theological debate in the year 200 and say Scripture alone. No, what you knew about baptism, the Eucharist, the Trinity, was derived from the oral tradition of the bishops in apostolic succession going back to the apostles. So this is a magnificent point of apologetics for Catholic Christians. Also, it teaches us that there's an importance of tradition in interpreting Scripture. Scripture doesn't drop out of heaven. It doesn't arrive on a silver platter. Scripture is actually part of tradition that is handed down over time. And so, as we'll see, as we continue in these lessons on the New Testament, we'll see that as we interpret Scripture, we must have tradition with it to read it properly. Hey, thanks for being a member of the New St. Thomas Institute, and we'll see you in the future lessons on the New Testament.